Welcome back, AP Bio. We're going to be talking chapter 41.2 and 41.3 today in community ecology. So starting off, I want to talk about diversity because as we start to add more organisms to what we're studying at a time, it's really important to understand how diversity plays a role. So diversity is, just like in any other context, how many of something there is, the variety of different organisms that make up our community and our ecosystem. And there's two ways to measure this. We can measure this in terms of species richness, just how many there are, and we can measure this in relative abundance or the proportion of each that there are. And so when we look at these two communities down here, they have the same species richness of 4 species, but in community 1, that relative abundance is much, much higher than in species 2. And the unit that we use is something called the Simpson Diversity Index. And in this class, we're not really going to get into how do you calculate that. I think we've had enough math this year. But if you're interested, you can look up the Simpson Diversity Index. And it's a real simple calculation, but it helps you figure out how diverse it is. And that's going to be really bringing in that relative abundance, not just species richness. But diversity is super important because it means that your community is more stable. It's more healthy. More diversity means you're more tolerant. So when things happen to your community, bad things or big disturbances, having more diversity means you've got more traits that could be successful, and you're going to have a better chance that your ecosystem is going to survive that. When we're analyzing the diversity in ecosystem, we're going to be talking about trophic structure as well, or where in the food chain or food web they exist. So this is basically just what is eating what. Where are you getting your energy from? So you may have in previous classes talked about food chains, and there's all sorts of expression like top of the food chain. But realistically, there's no such thing as a food chain because everything in biology is so interconnected. So we're going to be mostly focusing on food webs. The important thing to remember when you're reading these charts or diagrams is that the arrow always points in the direction that the energy travels. So here we have birds and fishes. Those fishes are pointing to birds because birds eat the fish. So the energy from the fish goes into the birds. Now, you're going to want to be familiar with a few of these terms. So things like producer. A producer is a plant or a bacteria or a lichen or an algae that photosynthesizes. So photosynthesis means it takes its energy from the sun and makes food. So anything that can photosynthesize is going to be a producer because it doesn't eat anything. It takes all its energy from the sun. So the sun is bringing all the initial energy. Anything that eats that grass or that producer is going to be a primary consumer because it's the first level of consuming. Anything that eats primary consumers is a secondary consumer. Anything that eats secondary consumers is a tertiary consumer. We can go up to quaternary consumers. But usually at the very top, anything that's not eaten by anything else we refer to as an apex predator. So that means it's the very top of that food web. It has no arrows going away from it. It only has arrows going towards it because it eats things. Another important thing is most food webs aren't this simple. Many things eat many things. And so sometimes something could be like an omnivore where it's a primary consumer because it eats plants, but also maybe eats other animals. So like a bluebird, if it eats both nuts from plants and bugs, it's an omnivore. So it's both a primary and a secondary consumer. Most tertiary and quaternary consumers are also secondary consumers because they also eat those primary consumers and secondary consumers. Then the most important aspect of any food web, and you should always include it, are decomposers. And really, I don't like this diagram very much because you should have arrow going from the plants to the decomposers, primary, secondary, and tertiary all going to the decomposers because the decomposers break down everything. So 2 terms you're going to want to know, decomposer and a detrivore. I'll move my face here because I know you want to see it. Decomposers break down dead material and then recycle those nutrients back into the soil or the ecosystem. So these are typically going to be like fungi and bacteria. Detritivores are things that eat detritus. They're also known as scavengers. And so they remove rotting waste from the ecosystem by eating that dead material. A mushroom can't eat anything, so it's not a detritivore. It's a decomposer. But a worm or a vulture or a hyena or a jackal that's eating something that's already dead, that it didn't kill, those are going to be those detritivores. All right. So another important thing to look at is a keystone species. So a keystone species is anything that its niche is depended on the most by every other species in the ecosystem. If the species were removed, it would cause a total collapse of diversity disproportionate to the abundance of it. So even though there may be only a few of them, they're super important for everything. For example, sea otters, they eat everything that lives in a kelp forest. But because they in particularly eat urchins, they keep the kelp forest in check. Because if they weren't eating urchins, urchins can outcompete all the mussels and abalones and everything else. And so if they're not there to eat them, those urchins start to eat the kelp forest. And when the kelp forest goes, there's no protection, so the fish swim away because there's no rotting, nothing falling down. Some of those ground feeders can't eat, and it just destroys the whole ecosystem. It's important to note that a keystone species is not always at the top of the food chain. Frequently it is in the top-down regulation, so where we're regulating what's below us in the food chain by eating them and keeping them in check. But it's not always that, so that's really important to note. It's not always the top of the food chain, it just a lot of the times is. And when we're looking at these keystone species or anything else, it brings up the concept of a trophic cascade. So a trophic cascade is where when you are doing that top-down regulation, you're not just influencing what's below you, but like a waterfall cascades down. Those effects of you eating that are going to cascade down to all other areas of the food web. So for example, crabs eat snails, so they destroy them. But they have a positive influence on the salt marsh grasses because those snails destroy it. Same with like those sea otters, eat those urchins, which eats kelp. But then not only does that have a benefit there, but all sorts of other animals that also may eat the salt grass because it's more abundant, they're doing stronger. Now, because those primary consumers are stronger, secondary and tertiary consumers are going to be stronger. So these trophic cascades have wide-ranging effects on an ecosystem. An example in the Pacific Northwest, like I talked about with those urchins being eaten by sea otters, an interesting study was done that showed that boating that changed the habitats of orcas. Well, as those orcas migrated into areas that to avoid boats where sea otters were living, all of a sudden, there was a huge collapse of kelp density and biodiversity in the area because sea urchins exploded when the otters started getting eaten by those sea whales. So just an example right here in the Pacific Northwest of what's going on with trophic cascades. We watched this video in class, so I'm not going to make you watch it again. That's all for 41.2, but I'm going to quick roll into 41.3 as well, because all we're going to really be talking about here is disturbances. So a disturbance is any event that changes what's going on in the community. Maybe it's abiotic factors like climate's changing or availability of some nutrients. Maybe it's biotic factors, so certain plants are leaving or certain animals have arrived. Any disturbance. Now, a disturbance isn't necessarily bad because it shakes things up. If you only had everything perfectly stable, you'd have one or two organisms compete to the top and everything else would die off. But if you have a few disturbances every once in a while, you're going to have more species actually. Diversity likes disturbances because disturbances gives their reason to be diversity. More disturbances, you need more traits in an ecosystem to survive it and support the others. And so disturbances are actually good. But if you have too many disturbances, nothing can survive because it's changing too fast and things are going to die off. Now, disturbances are going to lead us into the idea of succession. So what happens after the disturbance? And how does your ecosystem recover? So there's two forms of succession. First is primary succession. This is the first time soil is made and the first time things live in an area. So this is like bare rock, like molten lava from a volcano has formed a new island, and it's just rock and no life. Over time, pioneer species start to spread their seeds, their spores start to land on the rock, and things like lichens and moss start to break down the rock into soil. That allows for seeds of small annual plants to start growing. That allows for grasses to start coming in, and they secure that soil and add more nutrients to the soil. So now seeds from larger species can come. Now that you have plants, animals can start coming and feeding on them. Secondary consumers are going to start coming in, tertiary consumers, and eventually you reach this climax community that's very diverse, very healthy, and rich with all kinds of different species. Secondary succession is where you have an existing community that already has a wide variety of species, but a disturbance happens. So like a wildfire comes through, kills a lot of things. But there's already soil. So we don't have to go through this long 100-year process of lichens breaking down rock into soil. We've already got that soil. So existing seeds can sprout or new seeds start coming in, and you start having within a couple years short plants. After a few more years, a few decades, you start to see taller trees and a more diverse animal ecosystem, and you start to have all these species. Now, you'll notice in both of them, there's something called pioneer species. These are the first species to inhabit an area. So these are really important for ecological succession because you can't just drop an elephant on bare rock and have it survive. You can't just drop a giant pine tree and have it survive. You need some of these small species to start to prepare the ecosystem, to build this trophic structure, to build our food web. So these first species are always going to be R-selected because they're going to make millions of offspring and just spray them to the wind, and they're not going to need parental care to survive. They're not going to need any sort of nutrients to survive. They're just going to latch on and start growing, and that's going to foster a whole community over time to grow. So that's ecological succession. That's it for 41.3. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you next time. My computer is slow and it won't stop the recording.